And now we're going to go to an update on a regional framework panel. The panel is going to be made up of various individuals, but first I want to introduce Forrest Schaefer. Forrest is a state coordinator for the task force. And Forrest, we'll let you make your opening comments as the panel comes up. And if you could introduce, or they could introduce themselves, that'd be great.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Chief Tyler. We are, well, I should introduce myself. I'm Forrest Schaefer. I'm the state coordinator of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. I have a really keen interest in the topic that we're discussing today because as little as 9 months ago, I was myself a regional implementer. And one thing I can say is that for years, I had been talking with lots of colleagues working regionally about how much we need these flexible, adaptable frameworks from the state to really be able to implement the priorities that we need. And so now the tables have turned and we need to hear from regional leadership how we can adapt our programs and how the task force can best respond to continue strengthening those processes and those mechanisms for adaptable frameworks, whether that's policy or whether that's funding. But I also know that things are a lot different today than they were 5, 10, 20 years ago as we've had these conversations. We're seeing massive investments on a scale that has never been seen before in this field. We're seeing a recognition that those investments need to take forms beyond simply implementing projects. We need to plan projects. We need to build the pipeline. We need to invest in wood products innovations. We need to invest in capacity and workforce development. But probably the most important change is we're seeing regions organizing themselves and partnerships organizing themselves at a scale larger than we have ever seen before. And so the opportunity to move and continue building these systems with regionally driven priorities that meet state mandates, we're at that point where we can really start meeting those needs. And that's exactly the purpose for today's panel, is to hear from regional partners on how they are organizing themselves for not just large scale implementation, but also capacity building and sustainability into the future. So we are today joined by 4 regional leaders. We have kind of a cross section from across the state. We have 1 representative from each of the 4 task force regions that you see on the map at the moment. Now, we have some different representatives. In some cases, we have organizations like the Conservancies that work throughout the entire task force region that they're covering. We also have examples of organizations that are forging newer, bigger partnerships that extend even beyond the boundaries of their organizations themselves for larger scale coordination. And so from some examples of the first, with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy representing the Sierra Cascade region, we have Angie Avery. Angie is the executive officer of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. From Central California, we have Mary Small. Mary is the deputy director of the State Coastal Conservancy. And then from the other category, we have Mike O'Connell. Mike O'Connell is the president and CEO of the Irvine Ranch Conservancy, but is also organizing beyond the boundaries of the Irvine Ranch Conservancy throughout Southern California. And then similarly, Karen Gaffney, who's the director of strategic planning and communications at the North Coast Resource Partnership, is working not just in the very large North Coast region, but also coordinating with other partners in Northern California. So in particular today, I wanted to focus first on some of the task force's mandates. And in the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, the Mobilized Regional Action Plan section highlights 3 key actions that the task force and task force partners will be focused on implementing moving forward. First is expanding the Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program. Second is developing a network of both regional landscape and community fire resilience plans. And then third is developing a pipeline of local and regional shovel-ready projects, but also the implementation strategies to ensure sustained funding for implementing that pipeline. Some of the tools that the task force has been providing like we just heard with the interagency treatment tracker early on, but then also other components of the regional resource kit, is to provide the data and tools needed for regions to organize themselves at larger scale and assess at larger scales. The Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Program has succeeded in its goal of expanding its program. It now covers nearly 100% of the fire-prone areas in the state through either its grantees or subgrantees. And then one of the key challenges looking forward is thinking about how to make these investments across the readiness spectrum, whether it's a nascent new partnership that is just beginning to plan projects and build out that pipeline, or whether it's areas that are in critical need and are also critically ready to move forward with large-scale implementation. So providing some examples here of the Forest Service wildfire crisis strategy landscapes among some other federal programs, one of the BLM's critical landscapes, but then also, which you'll hear further from Angie in a little bit, Sierra Nevada Conservancy's implementation-ready landscapes. So balancing the needs of those two is going to be one of the key themes of the panel today. And so with that, we will transition to the presentations, and here's the logistics part of this. We're going to hear in turn from each of the four panelists. There's actually, I think, going to be a little bit of conversation and questions among the panelists. So of course, feel free to jump in at any time to ask questions of your other panelists. With that, I'm going to start out with Angie. Welcome, Angie, and thank you for joining me. Yeah, you can advance to the right.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's good to be here with all of you. Talking about this specific topic, it's just about nearly a year since we did the regional meeting in Grass Valley, where we announced our landscape investment strategy. So I'm happy to be here with all of you today to talk a little bit about where we've gone and how far we've gone and some of the things that we've done since last September. So, as you have been hearing, California has wisely embraced a regional approach to addressing challenges across a really varied and very large state. Every region is different, as we all know. The Southern California needs and issues, even from veg management perspective, are really, really different than what we have in the Sierra Nevada. And that's true from the northern portion of the state to the southern portion of the state. So SNC is really committed to implementing a wildfire resilience strategy that works in the Sierra Nevada, Sierra Cascade region for folks who live and work in the Sierra Cascade region. The region that we serve is shown there in green, just in case you were curious. So throughout our region, local groups really have been identifying the places on the ground and the landscapes that are the most important to them from the local perspective. Where are the communities, the natural resources, the assets that are most valuable for them in terms of what they're working to protect? And we know that scaling collaboration to large landscapes requires multiple organizations and tribes coming together with resources and experience to commit to the effort and move in the same direction and in coordination with one another. So we launched the Landscape Grant Pilot Program as a regional at the task force meeting, like I said, last September, but really to look at and start by looking at the readiness of collaborative groups already working in the region, who've already identified landscapes and assets that are important to them, and who are taking the time to think about what it looks like to work at a much larger scale. Through our process, the Sierra Nevada Conservancy identified 6 collaborative groups that are ready to implement at the landscape scale now. Those are the hatched areas that you see on the map on the screen, and 7 that'll be ready for implementation in the next 1 to 2 years timeframe. And these are groups that have identified projects. There are projects in their pipeline, and they continue to add to those pipelines. So this first group of 6 are ready for large scale investment, and they're ready to get that work started now. Key ingredients that we looked at as we were trying to determine what the readiness of these groups were is they're identified here on the screen. From our perspective, this is the secret sauce. All of these elements need to be in place in order to accept very large grants, to be effective, and with that funding, to get it on the ground quickly and efficiently with the most strategic impact. Of course, that means you have to have money and they have to, in order for them to implement. And as we have been hearing, funding really is flowing into the region. There's a lot of work that needs to get done, but federal agencies that have been called out by others here today, the wildfire, the Forest Service, federal investment, BLM investment, that's all happening across the landscape. Sorry, I went too far, too fast. But one of the things that we know is that a lot of the money historically up to this point in time has been coming in at a project level, as opposed to the shift that we've seen recently with the wildfire crisis strategy investment from the Forest Service and others. This really creates problems for implementation for the folks who are working on the ground. It means that so much money is in the system, but it's flowing through all of these different entities. And Chief Tyler was mentioning this a little bit earlier as well. This causes problems. It causes inefficiencies. It's hard for groups to be working and getting and focusing on implementation when they're having to manage tracking the various grant programs, applying for the various grant programs, reporting out on the various grants that they're receiving across time. It's just, from our perspective, it's a lot inefficient. And so this was one of the drivers for the creation of our landscape investment strategy. I think many of you have already heard this, but the landscape investment strategy really was developed as a regional strategy to create a clear and understandable pathway and process for attracting and implementing very large sums of money across very large landscapes. Really, with the shift, our goal was really to shift sort of the focus from the hundreds of acres projects to the thousands of acres of projects. So this flow chart shows the various pathways that people who live and work in our region can access S&C support. Our goal with our landscape investment strategy really is to meet partners where they are, to provide funds suited to their needs, whether that's individual project implementation, capacity building, technical assistance, or a landscape scale grant. We know that this approach is necessary in large, widely dispersed areas with significant differences in capacity and resources. And I want to be super clear, one of the funding sources that I didn't call out specifically on a previous slide is the Department of Conservation Regional Forest and Fire Capacity Investment. We don't move to landscape scale opportunities for investment without all of the variety of capacity investments that come along with that funding. And it's really been critical, I think, in our region. So this slide really just shows the 4 primary goals of the landscape grant pilot program. Again, we really were designing this program to test the ways that a landscape grant could be used to accelerate forest management by pooling from multiple state and federal agencies to provide larger grants across the region, especially to collaboratives that have done the work and the planning and are ready and capable of receiving large sums of investment. Our hope really was to enable quick implementation of funding, at least on one landscape scale, one landscape to start, and sort of remove some of those administrative hurdles that I mentioned a little bit ago. We made a choice and our board approved an initial investment under our landscape grant pilot program. We came together with CAL FIRE and the U.S. Forest Service to get to a total of $10 million investment in the Healthy El Dorado Landscape Partnership. This is a partnership that's working on the El Dorado National Forest. The landscape they're working in is about 185,000 acres in total. It's that green and unburned area of the Crystal Basin that sits between the 2014 King Fire and the 2021 Caldor Fire. Of course, it's home to massive carbon stores, water, power, and recreation infrastructure and assets. We're super grateful to CAL FIRE and the Forest Service for your contributions to the landscape grant investment that we've done. It was a new process. There were hurdles and challenges, but it was worth the time and effort to work through those to make this ultimate decision. Okay, I think that's it for me for now.
Your last slide.
Okay, good. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Angie, very much for the presentation. Next, we are going to hear from Mary Small with the State Coastal Conservancy, so I'll welcome you up. Oh, and I think you had a question for Angie, though. Please go ahead.
Angie ran away. I think it's so great what's going on in Sierra Nevada, and I am sort of curious if you have any lessons learned in the past year that you want to, because I think we're a little bit behind, so.
So many things that we learned. First of all, $10 million on a landscape of 185 million acres is a drop in the bucket. When you have 6 landscapes that are working at that scale or larger, that's a lot of investment that's ultimately needed to just get started. It's very, very challenging to pool state funding across state agencies based on sort of statutory requirements associated with each funding, the administrative burdens, the grant programs, but it's very, very challenging to pool state investment, pots of money across state agencies. The data that is coming out of the resource toolkits is actually really, really interestingly helpful to looking at the projects as they're being proposed and to start thinking about the outcomes that you're getting from these very large investments. And so that was another lesson that we learned. There's a couple of other ones that I have written down that I'm not finding quickly. General comment on the work that's happening across the Sierra Nevada region. There's some really good large landscape scale planning that's already happening. And I mentioned how important the DOC funding is to kind of continuing to elevate the other areas beyond the 12 or 13 that we identified in our process. Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And thank you for making my job as a moderator easy. I don't even think that's the question. Here's Mary Small.
Here I am. Good afternoon and thank you. I'm Mary Small. I'm the Deputy Director of the State Coastal Conservancy, and I'm here to give you a quick snapshot of what's going on in the Central California region. And I want to just start by thanking the task force and the Department of Conservation for having this regional approach. I think it's really, really critical. And as Angie said, echoing the importance of investing in capacity building. In order to get to the outcomes we want, we have to make this work move faster and we have to drive the costs down. And so I'm going to give you a quick update on some of the status of our regional planning efforts and then some examples of the investments that we're making in capacity building. This is our region, the Central Coast. It stretches from Marin County to Santa Barbara County. While I think that the regional approach is really good, we got this map and we immediately broke it up into subregions. And I think that's obvious. We all know that, there's a lot of difference between Marin County and San Benito County, and having them have one plan doesn't make any sense. So we need to plan at meaningful scales. And we also wanted to build on existing collaborations. And so leverage where that work was already happening and then bring partners together. We're largely, where that wasn't happening. So we're largely working at the county or by county scale in terms of the regional planning. These 2 slides are just to drive home that point about our region. The one on the left is from the regional profile of the different kinds of vegetation communities that we have within the Central California region. And then the snapshot on the right is from the California Protected Area Database to just show the 15 types of public landowners in the Bay Area. So the heterogeneity of land ownership is a really inherent challenge in our region kind of throughout. I'm going to give you 2 examples of 2 of the regional prioritization plans that we think are essentially done in our region. The first is the Marin County plan, and this was done, One TAM Coalition was doing a really intensive planning effort for all of Marin County, thinking about forest health and ecosystem health and climate change, and within that, fire risk. And then the Marin Wildfire Prevention Authority was thinking about wildfire risk in the built environment looking out. And so together they have a really comprehensive plan for that county that looks at kind of both of those elements. A second example within our region came out of really a climate change effort in Santa Barbara, where partners were coming together thinking about climate adaptation, and they have developed a priority plan really focusing in on wildfire risk within that county. Across our region, I think the prioritization plans look slightly different in different places, but elements that are consistent in all of them. Pretty much everywhere they're being, the fine scale vegetation mapping is getting completed and is being used as sort of one of the key base layers in almost all of the planning efforts that we're doing. And obviously that vegetation mapping is going to be useful for 30 by 30 and a whole bunch of other state initiatives. They all are also plans that ultimately end up with this list of projects. That's one thing that we all have. And I think most importantly, the planning efforts are about bringing people together, people working on the ground, and having them agree on what are the priorities within the region. I want to just talk quickly about some of the capacity investments that we are also investing in. And actually, I meant to say at the very beginning, I'm going to say we a lot. I've already said we a lot, and that is not the Coastal Conservancy. It is a very big we in our region. We're working with the resource conservation districts, with the fire safe councils, with CAL FIRE, and many, many, many other partners. So I have already left them out, and I'm just kind of giving examples of the work that's happening. But there's a lot of the funding that we're getting from the Department of Conservation that is going to paying people to do the work and paying people to get trained. These are two snapshots from cultural burning programs, one by the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria out at Tole Lake in Sonoma County. And then on the right is the Tamian Nation fire crew that is getting trained up to do cultural burning at Henrico State Park. So we're training people to do the work and then also paying for people to do the planning that's needed to develop the projects. We're also funding a lot of pilot projects. And one of the big issues within our region is biomass, what to do with biomass. This is some photos from East Bay Park's pilot project, using a carbonator to turn eucalyptus logs into biochar that they're then using on their property. We funded the initial pilot, and then that was successful, and they're now looking at figuring out how they could set up a permanent regional facility to process logs in the Bay Area. And prior to this, those logs were getting trucked all the way to Stockton to a cogen facility. So we're really excited about that. We've also funded similar biochar projects at Elkhorn Slough and on the peninsula, and there's a lot of information exchange between those, lessons learned, really trying to scale up that work within our region. And then finally, driving down the costs, we really are investing in trying to make the processes work better. And so we funded the consultants that worked with the Coastal Commission on developing the public works process that has now been used several times to get projects to basically use the vegetation treatment PEIR and get it to fit within the constraints of the Coastal Act. It's not a perfect process, but it is making the work move much more quickly than it did in the past. And those projects are getting permitted and approved. And then we are also acting as the lead on some projects where that needed to happen. And I think that is it. Yeah, thank you. Do I stay? Okay.
So you talked about a very diverse element. What are some challenges to finding the getting level of collaboration that you need, and to not only have people work at that scale, but also to prioritize effectively?
I think that some places where there were existing collaborations, we could kind of plug into them, and some places where we could support the planning that folks knew they needed to do. There was a lot of receptivity. I think where there's a challenge is where there are a lot of partners who feel like they have done enough planning already, really. And what's why do we need to do another plan? Could we just staple together the plans we have? And maybe we can't, maybe we don't need a plan. Maybe we do just need a big stapler. And so I think that's, if we get to regional funding and there's a real incentive, that would be one thing. But right now, if we're bundling all these things up into one plan, but then we have to take them apart to apply to 3 different grant programs, it's a little hard it's hard to explain why we're doing that.
Okay, thank you, Marin. It's interesting because as we travel around the state, we get to hear from kind of one partnership at a time. And I think bringing these all these different regions and frameworks that have evolved and adapted themselves, it's really useful to hear it in context. Next, from the Irvine Ranch Conservancy, we have Mike O'Connell from Southern California.
Thank you, Forrest. I could make this easy. I could just violently agree with everything Mary said and then sit down. We work in a region that is extremely institutionally fragmented, and the big challenge is getting everyone to work together. Plus, it's a region that doesn't naturally fit in terms of the way those collaborations have been set up. So San Diego doesn't spend a lot of time talking to San Bernardino, but yet they may be in competition. The way that we're approaching it, I guess, where do I switch? The right arrow key. Did I screw it up? There we go. Okay, cool. So the way we've taken the approach in Southern California is to kind of look at it sort of like a nested set of regions. There's the big region that you all have identified in the task force, and it makes sense. You have to put a line around something. But where things are done is much, much closer to the ground. And then there are sub-regions in Southern California that have more in common with each other. So coastal Southern California has a lot in common. The fire regime in San Diego is very similar to the fire regime in Ventura. So it's a natural collaboration for them. So it makes it complicated, but thinking about this region as being essentially a set of multiple sub-regions at different scales makes a big difference in terms of how we're able to work together. The sort of the seed for this, if you will, is the RFFC program. And I'd like to add my compliments to the Department of Conservation. That is just game-changing money. I cannot say it any more strongly than that. It's allowed everyone to create the capacity to do the collaboration that we need in order to get all of these projects identified. We've had a huge gap between our strategy and what we know needs to be done in these various areas and shovel-ready projects. And that gap is capacity, and RFFC is what's filling that. So if you look, now these colored blobs are the RFFC grantees, and they cover most of Southern California, the region. But then if you add in the urban areas, which are gray, and you add in the CAL FIRE units, and you add in the Forest Service, it's pretty much all covered. So collaboration among the RFFC grantees, the Forest Service, and the CAL FIRE units, in addition to the fact that I believe 4 out of the 6 CAL FIRE contract counties are in Southern California. So that's all done locally as well. There's the makings of some collaboration that's not quite as complicated as you might see on the surface. I also know that you can see from this map, we have an overwhelming amount of wildland-urban interface and a population. I just smiled when Angie said their population is 900,000 people. We have 22 million people, I think. Yeah, so there's an awful lot of risk from these urban wildlands. So a couple of things about the Southern California region, just for you to know, it is a very diverse set of fire regimes. I work on the coast, and so I think mostly about the coastal fire regimes, which are not fuel driven at all. They're wind driven. I mean, we've had hundreds of thousands of acres burn in 3-year-old fuels. It's about ignitions and winds on the coast. But in the montane forests, in the San Bernardinos, in the Santa Anas, the Cleveland National Forest, there are forest health issues as well. We've had a way above average rainfall this year in Southern California. We had 37 inches in Orange County at the top of San Diego Peak. And so it's leading to increased fuel loads this year. Our key issues then are ignition prevention, structure and infrastructure resilience, strategic fuel modification and forest health, and capacity and workforce development. So just to talk about the collaboration that we're doing, this is sort of the nested regions, if you will. There are 6 Southern California RFFC programs, and I won't go through each one of them, but they're all working together very closely. Each of the principal staff people for these RFFC programs, they get along very well. One of the things that they've done is hosted a regional convening for Southern California, and our second one is actually coming up on the 13th of September. And so there are monthly meetings of this group, and there's a lot of conversation going on there. And then we're also working on putting together an MOU among all of the primary implementers to try to address the Forest Health Block Grant and coordinate around that. So to minimize competition and maximize leverage there. I also have to note that you saw from the map, the other key actor in all of this is the U.S. Forest Service. I have to give them an enormous amount of credit. Scott Tangenberg, who's the Cleveland National Forest Supervisor, and Jeff Hayes, who works for Scott, but was just named the Southern California region-wide fire person. I don't know, in fact, what the noun is, that he is a specialist or something like that, but Jeff has done a fantastic job, and they have engaged fully and are taking responsibility for even looking at things like ignition reduction along roads in the forest. So if you take a look at that, coordinating really actively and tightly at each of these local RFFC levels, coordination among the RFFC programs, then coordination at the regional level among all of the actors, and active participation and collaboration with state and federal participants. And that's how we're gonna try to solve this problem that Mary and I are dealing with. The other thing I'll note is that the California Fire Safe Council County Coordinator Program is a big part of this as well. Our county coordinator is actually here, Oscar Hood, and they are working very closely in every one of the subregions with the RFFC program, and it's actually going quite well. And I'll just close by saying that I am really, really impressed with my state. The fact that you're thinking about the regionalization of this, and not just that it's important, but that these are different and they need support. And this is not a one-size-fits-all thing. 2 or 3 years ago, everyone was saying, we're just going to go out and cut down trees and then it's going to stop the fire problem. I am really impressed with how far this has come, and I want to thank you and thank you for the work the task force is doing.
Quick question, Michael. Just so impressive what you're accomplishing in Southern California, and definitely with that population and the diversity of partners. Can you give an example of a way that you were able to successfully drive alignment among this incredible diverse set of people and entities, and kind of what some of the outcomes were from that alignment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll try to give a simple answer. I think it has to do with what Mary was saying as well, where we've kind of tried to build on collaborations that are already existing and try to then build some bridges between those. So there's a lot of collaboration going on in San Diego, a lot going on in the Santa Monica Mountains, LA Ventura. They're talking about the same things, but they haven't been talking. So we're building the regional collaboration by connecting all of those through. And frankly, it's the RFFC program that's done that. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Finally, we have Karen Gaffney with North Coast Resource Partnership.
Thank you, Forrest. Good afternoon, members of the task force. Right here, thank you. I'm Karen Gaffney with the North Coast Resource Partnership, and I'm so pleased to be here today for this conversation. And as you see here, we're part of the northern region, and my partners from Tehama and Napa RCDs, we meet with them all the time, very collaborative relationship. I'll speak today just about the partnership, and hopefully you'll be hearing from them at a future meeting. So the North Coast region is 19,000 square miles, and it is a source region for carbon, biodiversity, and water. It's home to 30 federally recognized tribes, and all are part of 7 North Coast counties, and it's all the coastal watersheds that drain to the coast. So it's a hydrologic definition. It's been heavily impacted by wildfire, including right now, as we know, and it's economically challenged. It is severely economically disadvantaged, with over 50% of the population living under the poverty line. And there's a lot of diverse perspectives, as you can imagine. The North Coast Resource Partnership itself has a mission of enhancing the quality of life in North Coast communities and ecosystems. It was formed in 2004, and it's a coalition of thousands of partners, NGOs, RCDs, private business, tribes, counties, cities in the North Coast region. And its principles are strongly focused on equity and transparency, finding common ground, respecting local autonomy of tribes and counties, developing a shared vision, and also having a really strong reliance on science and data, including local knowledge and indigenous science. It's led, and this is nationally unique, by a coalition of appointees from the region's tribes and local governments. So it's sovereign nations working with local governments. And one of the long-term principles of the partnership since its inception has been aligning and integrating state and federal partner priorities. And so that includes things, of course, like the Task Force Resilience Plan and the Million Acre Strategy, but also the regional profiles, toolkits, frameworks, and investment strategies, which we're talking about today. And then we have long-term partnerships with all of the groups you see listed here, all the agencies you see listed, but that's certainly not an exhaustive list. For example, we're working with OPR right now on biomass and woody feedstock aggregation. We also constantly downscale, align with, and integrate data and models that are coming from the Forest Service, the state of California, and other academic partners, and of course, this task force. To date, we have administered over $100 million in state and federal partner funding, some philanthropic funding, in the form largely of block grants. And so I know we're talking about regional investment strategies here. We want to talk to you about that. And we do a lot of project tracking and performance reporting on the over 2,000 projects that we have identified and in our pipeline that are at an array of levels of readiness, and some of them are completed. And I should say that, I'm here today carrying a message from our Leadership Council of tribal and county appointees. And so the things that I am saying to you are the things that they would like you to hear. So as several folks have noted, the capacity investments that have been made by Department of Conservation, but also DWR, who I see is here today. I think I saw Kamyar, and the Regional Water Quality Control Board and foundations are foundational to the ability to have a landscape project portfolio and to have a project pipeline that actually is functional and is fair. And so in support of that, we have had a long-term TA program that has been expanded greatly by DOC funding, which supports people at a continuum of readiness, but also makes sure that everybody gets to participate in this significant funding that is coming down, and that we don't see a bifurcation between high resource entities and low resource entities. We do a lot of capacity assessments using remote sensing or census data at the regional scale, but also a lot of quantitative capacity assessments at the local scale. Right now, we're doing a tribal fire department capacity assessment that helps to guide our investments. We're also developing with DOC funding a North Coast regional capacity enhancement strategy, and then tiering from that individual entity capacity enhancement strategies with funding from DOC. We're so happy collectively that you are thinking about this new funding paradigm, because we think it's the answer to so many things and the wave of the future. As you well know, the current challenges with funding in regions like ours, and probably everywhere, are the volatility of grant cycles. We have capacity that builds up and then crashes down, often because grant cycles run in about a 3-year time frame. We also, as I alluded to before, have quite a few barriers to low capacity entities, and that can be solved, as Angie and Mary were saying, by having a regional actor there to really help build that capacity and do a lot of the administrative overhead work, so that it doesn't have to be done by 100 groups, it can be done by one. So what I'm bringing from our Leadership Council is that there is a strong need for long-term, significant, stable funding at the scale of the problem, not volatile funding. And we have heard and acknowledge and appreciate and agree with concerns and challenges that have been identified around accountability. What's the value and benefit to the taxpayer? What's the ROI to the taxpayer? Those are all real. In the last 18 years, we've come up with what we think are some of the solutions, certainly not all of them. And those are around having really high standards for performance reporting, having really clear fiscal accountability, just holding people accountable to a very high level of standard of performance if they're going to be a regional collaborative entity. demonstrating impact, ideally in a quantitative way whenever possible, and then having really credible and equitable identification, prioritization, and decision-making that's done in public. And in our case, it's done by folks who represent thousands of constituents in the North Coast region, whether they're tribal council members or tribal appointees or county supervisors. And we, again, NCRP thinks the benefits of this are that you will get more effective and efficient project outcomes on the ground, and that you will get stronger alignment of federal, state, and local priorities, since I know you care deeply about what local entities want in the North Coast region and elsewhere. Quickly, this is a prioritization framework that was developed out of the DOC vision plan that we completed last December and was adopted and approved by our leadership council. We'll be moving forward into implementation of this with those thousands of projects that I mentioned. But basically, it uses regional assessments and spatial analysis and modeling combined with and integrated with Indigenous science, local knowledge, and TEK to drive the suite of strategic actions and projects. So it's not just remote sensing, it's not just local knowledge, it's both. 1 + 1 = 100. That then drives the prioritization, evaluation, and selection of projects and actions. And then we come up with a collaborative shared regional vision plan like the one that DOC funded that is high level, but we're now moving into making it really specific and actionable. All along, there's technical assistance and capacity investments to make sure all boats rise. And then as we implement plans and projects, we then report on them and understand and change based on that reporting, and the wheel turns again. So it's very adaptive, and it is underlain everywhere by decision-making by our tribal and county representatives. So democracy at its finest is what we like to call it. So finally, this is my last slide. This is an example of that in action. So with the generous support and help from the California Natural Resources Agency, I see Loretta Moreno here, I believe, and USGS, as well as Scripps and a bunch of local agencies in Humboldt and Sonoma County, as well as the Yurok tribe and others. We have recently been able to acquire high-resolution LiDAR for the whole North Coast region. It was a huge gap. And so to have that remote sensing takes that first step on that regional remote sensing piece, and we can use that for things like evacuation planning. You can see all the houses there and the evacuation routes. In white is heavy areas of fuel loading, so we can see that on the landscape for the whole 19,000 square miles now. But we need to marry that to local knowledge, like you see these people at this potential operational delineations workshop, or people looking at how do you prioritize a whole landscape? What are the most important things to think about? We invite them into our prioritization process, our metrics process, our decision-making, our RFPs, everything fully transparent. And that's what drives projects on the ground, like the one you see here, where we're using prescribed fire to reduce some of those fuel loads, as well as many, many other tactics. So with that, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and also my incredible colleagues from all over the state, which has been an amazing part of this program, is to learn from these folks. So thank you.
I think you can take a seat. We had a question, but we're gonna keep on moving just to keep us on time. So thank you so much to all of our panelists for your presentations and really being able to, I think for the first time, give us a collective view of this large scale organization that's happening throughout the state of California, and really the coverage and the amount of work going into it is amazing. And so I'd like to make a few observations from the task force perspective that'll lead into a question that I have, same question for each of you, and then we'll transition to questions from the executive committee, discussion with the executive committee. So these observations are around really what's the value that I can see that you're bringing to California, to the people of California, and to statewide institutions that are looking to support these frameworks. First is you're providing the tools and the information that's needed so that investments can make a difference, and so that we can know that they're making a difference. That's because you're covering not just landscape restoration, but you're also considering community protection. You're also moving from kind of project by project, which makes it really difficult to move beyond that acres treated metric into looking at how are we reaching these overall goals in terms of capacity and the condition of the landscape. And you're also ensuring accountability for those investments along with that process. The second big piece is I think, moving even more towards a vision of resilience for all. I heard a lot of considerations for equity that are being built into these regional frameworks by making investments across the readiness spectrum and according to a variety of needs. And then finally, it's looking at the need and providing the ability to sustain investments that are made by any funder over time, because it's providing mechanisms to more effectively allocate resources, building the institutions that can help carry out that work over time, and really make sure that what we're investing is maintained into the future. So with that, that's really what the task force and what the state is looking for. And so my question for you, unless Patrick wants to jump in. Okay.
I want to put you on the spot. So what we've heard from each of you is you're transitioning from individual projects to bundles of projects. But as Mary said, it doesn't make a lot of sense to then unbundle them and submit grant applications. However, a lot of our grant programs haven't evolved that far yet. So here's my question. Let's say you had all the flexibility you needed. You can go each of you in rapid fire. You're given $100 million each. What would you do with that differently than what you do today with your money? What additional flexibility, how would you do things differently? And if you can, what would be your ballpark between planning and implementation? Do you have more than 100 million of shovel-ready projects? Would you put it all there? Or would you say, no, you need to spend half of it or more on planning? So just in general, if you were given the flexibility that you all say you want and you're building institutions to take advantage of, how would you do things differently? Make your case to our funders here.
On the ratio of planning to implementation, 10 to 90 is what I would say. We have had a ratio of 5 to 95 in the past. It has ramped up, and I think that has been largely because of the capacity and planning investments from our FFC, and they've been profoundly productive. In terms of what we would do differently, I think just expand the existing collaborative infrastructure. So we have this backbone organization, the NCRP, which is appreciated and valued and by partners, but we also have a really strong clarity around roles. So the NCRP plays a role of doing regional assessments, doing gap analysis, amplifying the need for investment, getting funding in the form of block grants, and then distributing it. But it doesn't say all the funding has to come through us. It helps partners apply for CAL FIRE grants or foundation grants or other grants. So I think keeping that flexibility and local autonomy in the structure, and then just expanding and stabilizing the structure over time, and frankly, continuing to adapt it. So, we learn occasionally by making somewhat serious mistakes, and people slap us upside the head, or they say you should have done this differently or whatever, and that's how we all learn, and that's okay as long as we're all committed to adaptive processes. But I do strongly believe that there is a huge economy of scope and scale by having an actual regional collaborative infrastructure that's doing once or twice the things that are now, as Mary and others said, being done 50 or 100 times by individual project sponsors, and then that becomes a barrier for their engagement.
We would do what she said, and thank you. We would also, I think the key to funding at we've been calling them block grants level, is that the alignment of those projects towards a regional strategy is much, much better and much more effective and strategic than having it aligned through a grant program with a title. And that happens at a distance, whereas we still have to fund projects, but the projects fit together and they fit into a broader strategy and a regional strategy, as long as you have the institution. In Southern California, we actually don't have, in contrast to where Angie is, there's no institution in Southern California that has its arms around the whole place. That's a big challenge for us, because you can't go to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and say, hey, fund all of these projects. It's always going to be fragmented. So that is the only way to overcome that is by having a regional plan that is not fragmented, and fund that plan, not the projects under the plan.
What they said. But I would add big chunks of money over a longer period of time. Like, give people a chunk of money and a chunk of time to implement it. I would look at investments that drive the cost of the work down. Like, we need to actually figure out how to make this work cheaper and get it done faster. Like, we are not going to always have $1 billion flowing into it. And we need to start to think about vegetation treatment as a natural infrastructure that we need to build from where we are right now, and then we need to maintain over time. And so there's a shift of mindset, I think, there. And then the last thing, similar, I think, to what Mike said is, for our region, there's such a diversity that you really have to meet people where they are. So there are some parts of the region where you just give them $20 million and go. But there are other ones where you would really need to invest in that capacity, in that planning, to get them ready to be able to handle it.
I have one really quick thing, which is, I think playing on what she said, I think we make a mistake when we think of this entire effort as a capital project. That's a capital program. We're not going to solve this problem and walk away from it. It's going to be something that operationally we're going to have to sustain over time. It's almost like we are taking care of the deferred maintenance, and then we're going to have to maintain things. So we need to get our arms around and our heads around the idea that it's an operational thing, not just a capital thing.
So the planning question is at the percent breakdown between implementation and planning for the Sierra Nevada region is kind of interesting for us, because the 13 landscapes that I identified as ready now or ready in 2 years, they've done the bulk of the planning, right? And so if I had $100 million, and just by the way, we've spent $100 million on 100 projects in the last 2 years, I would start investing deeply, heavily into the ready landscapes and continue to use the DOC investment to kind of keep elevating other landscapes so that they can kind of get that same level of investment. There would be no, I mean, one of the questions we're trying to answer for ourselves right now is, we made the choice with the Forest Service and CAL FIRE to invest in the Healthy Eldorado Landscape Partnership. What are we going to do for the others? So maybe $100 million gets me a better seat at the table with the Forest Service and CAL FIRE and others, WCB, where we can actually have a conversation about, I've got money to invest in these landscapes now. How do we do better job of amplifying each other's goals and missions and work and efforts? How do we turn $100 million on ready landscapes into $300 million? $500 million. What does that look like? Can we do that a little bit differently?
Okay, so with that question, I'm actually going to, rather than jump to the question that I had planned and told you all about, I think it would be even better with so many threads kind of coming out here. I do want to actually turn to the executive committee now to ask for follow-up questions or to dig into any particular responses. I definitely have some other questions I can move to, but I want to open it up to the executive committee first.
All right, thank you very much. We'll start with Doug.
So either any of you analyzed the effects of AB 338 on productivity in the future, if that passes?
So AB 338 is the prevailing wage bill that's out there. We have started to take a look at it, but we haven't done a deep analysis of how it will actually impact work on the ground. I think it depends on how the bill is ultimately written, what projects are exempt, what landscapes are exempt, where are there exemptions in terms of the level of funding. We do have concerns that requiring prevailing wage would create inefficiencies in the dollars we're trying to get on the ground, that we're hearing anecdotally from throughout our region that prevailing wage will reduce by half the amount of money, the amount of work that can get done with the amount of money that's out there. That said, we also know that there's a need for living wage throughout our region. And so there's more work that we would need to do to sort of weigh in one way or another. But it's an important question, and we're kind of curious to see where the ultimate edits go.
Any others? Back to the executive committee, Chief Tyler.
Sam.
Well, first of all, thank you. The panel discussion was really informative and useful. And what I kept hearing again and again, I think resonated for me is about partnerships, capacity. And those are also one of the hardest to fund. And we hear that in a lot of our OPR programs as well. When we engage with community, those words come up again and again. But we also know it's really critical to have those partnerships to be effective in significant changes and impacts of climate. Specific to capacity building, is there any sort of from each of your areas that you've seen what is effective, or how do you measure the outcome that often capacity building, from capacity building to results, depending on what it is, has such a gap? Is there any examples of how you measure outcomes from that?
It's such a great question, and we have grappled with it for some time. One of the ways that we document ROI from capacity investments is to look at leveraging. So for example, we have a TA program, it's fairly well established, that has a very simple RFP, so it's not a barrier for participation of low capacity entities. People basically say, I need help developing a CAL FIRE project, or I need permitting help, or I need GIS, or whatever type of help, design, engineering design. And then they receive the funding. They don't get it directly as a sub-grant. We have a whole pool of about 50 technical consultants that are brought on over years by an RFP process. Also, there are tribal technical consultants and engineers and permit folks. And we then allocate a certain amount of technical time for that consultant to help the requester. And then we document in the case of Humboldt Bay Municipal Water District, they got $5,000 in TA, and they parlayed that into a multi-million-dollar CAL FIRE grant. And that is what we're strongly documenting now. We're also in our capacity enhancement strategy trying to think about ways to quantitatively demonstrate that kind of bright blue line between capacity and outcomes on the ground, because we're happy that there's funding right now, but those questions that come up about nice words like collaboration and partnership, we have to be able to actually make sure we're showing that the rubber hits the road from those investments.
Can I just tag on to the leverage conversation? Just one bullet point that is super impressive to me. The first two grants that we got from the DOC totaled just under $10 million. Those two grants alone leveraged $95 million in implementation investment throughout our region. That's huge in our opinion. That's just an unbelievable dollar amount that came from a relatively small capacity investment.
Thank you. It's some of the results that we're seeing as well in some of our programs, in that one, leveraging, and it also requires partnerships when you're leveraging, and multi-benefit outcomes from each of the projects. And I appreciated your comment about how I forget how you said it, the vegetation should be seen as infrastructure. So we have significant amount of unprecedented investments in infrastructure. How do we then change the paradigm when those investments are coming, to look for partnerships, whether state agencies or private entities, to actually leverage and have a multi-benefit outcome in that partnership? So those are the kinds of things that come to mind for me in some of the most successful programs that we've had seen in different parts of OPR's capacity building or transformative climate communities, or any of those programs. So really appreciate that perspective.
I think we have time for one or two more questions, please.
We're good. All right. Sherry?
So I heard you all comment on pulses of funding, capacity building, the relevance and importance of meeting people where they are, the different levels where people are at. We've been trying to tackle this as a task force for a couple of years now. I think I hear from you that we're making a little bit of headway. If you had to prioritize the work that we engage in from here forward, which one would you start to tackle first? Are they linked in such a way that we can deal with them at the same time? And how would you suggest we go about doing that?
I'll take it up. Yeah. I think they're linked, and that we have to do multiple things at once. in a number of ways. I mean, I think continuing this regional approach is, you're hearing from the people working on regional approaches that we think it's the right approach. I think tackling the grants and sort of landscape scale funding is something that the task force is really well positioned to think about. And then I think we have to continue learning by doing. I mean, we don't have time to sit around and have the perfect plan and the perfect process. Like, we need to get going. So, you know, and I think as we do things, you know, we're really excited about like I call it our dumpster fire, but our biochar facility, because it has the potential to really reduce the cost of vegetation treatment in the Bay Area, because trucking trees to Stockton is very expensive. And so if we can start to test these regional solutions and find ways to make the work more efficient, that just builds momentum, you know. So I guess I think it's all of the above, and we just keep trying.
Just some thoughts about getting back to what Mr. Acefa said around multi-objective, multi-benefit linked with financing. And, you know, the fact that you have Jonathan Birdsong and the Moore Foundation here today is quite telling that you're already thinking about these things. But how do we turn over some of the rocks in financing and funding that are out there that are in unlikely places and bring those to bear on this, you know, daunting issue? So you're obviously already doing that, but let's think about doing more of that, like enhanced infrastructure financing district, ecosystem services, the wonderful bond that Blue Forest put together. So how do we do some more of that private public, you know, working with insurance companies? I know you're thinking about all of this, but really putting together a comprehensive strategy that takes all those funding tributaries, public, private, philanthropic, and brings them to bear on this daunting problem. And also, as Mr. Acefa was saying, thinking about, you know, how to, like, when something, you know, burns in Northern California and then it trashes the Klamath River ecosystem and the salmon up there, that's a multi-benefit, well, it's a multi-impact problem, but there's multi-benefit solutions that are climate solutions, water quality, biodiversity solutions, and wildfire solutions. And there's so much funding in California right now. And I think working with the regional partners to think about how to pull those threads around sea level rise and flooding, wildfire and aquatic ecosystem health and community health and safety all together and bring those funding streams together would be, I'm happy you're doing it. I shouldn't say it would be fantastic. I know you're already thinking about it, but I'd love to see that get elevated even further and amplified further.
I would add one other thing, which is I think we need to think more broadly about our measures of success that don't just go to acres treated. I think acres treated as a measure of success is the equivalent of saying all wildfire is a forest fire. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that we need to have lots of legitimate measures of success, but that get to some of these nuances that are more than just acres treated. Maybe acres protected, maybe acres resilient, but also communities that are resilient. So I'd encourage you to think about what those measures of success might be.
Really appreciate that feedback.
And
especially-
I would add just one other thing. I mean, everything that they said, because they're spot on. But this concept of, we talk about a lot about breaking silos, state silos. I had Forrest took it out, but there was an image in my last slide that sort of shows these different funding silos and a big rig, right? And so if you think about our goals as a state across all of our missions across California Natural Resources Agency, right now that truck goes to the CAL FIRE silo, the S&C silo, the Forest Service silo, the WCB silo, but those silos are 150 miles apart. So that truck is driving on twisty turny roads from that silo to that silo to that silo to that silo. If there was a way it could stop at one place and sort of pick up the funding across all of the agencies, if we could really give, if you all could really, and with the input from us, really give some consideration to climate goals and research goals and forest management goals and workforce goals and tribal capacity and utilize, you know, like there, I would love, in my ideal world, would love to see a single big rig stop at a silo depot that has, you know, 10 silos where we're pulling we as state agencies agree that we need to pull the funding and that funding then can get implemented on the ground in ways that amplify and magnify our individual investments to achieve state goals. And I think that if we can do that, it's easier for the NIFWIFs and the Moore Foundations and the other foundations to sort of come in and say, we want to be part of this. We want to have resilience outcomes on the landscape. That's what's important to us. How do we do that? So for me, that's a goal.
And Angie, that was an
it's-
electric semi, wasn't it?
It probably should be an electric semi. Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you to our panel for sharing your experiences with us today. We didn't quite get to our question of what do you need from the task force, but I think we got besides $100 million, or maybe that is the answer. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the executive committee for the great questions. And Chief Tyler, I'll pass back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you to Angie, Mary, Michael, and Karen. Great presentations. Appreciate that. Here was the takeaway for me. As a task force and the working groups within the task force, the recognition of the regions have different needs based on their fuel types and their geography. But what they really need is sustainable funding that can be pooled without the various administrative burdens. And while we recognize that even in a $30 billion deficit in the state budget in the current budget year, most funding is still intact, and we appreciate that of the administration moving